Hello, and welcome back. Today is another true crime video, and we're going to be covering Hobby Lobby, the Green family, and the smuggling of antiquities. So let's get started with what is Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby is an American craft store, so it sells arts and crafts like yarn, home decor, scrapbooking, thread, needles, like cross-stitch stuff, any sort of art or craft you can think of, they probably sell it. I think they also sell like a lot of fake flowers. I haven't been to Hobby Lobby many times, but I always remember thinking like, that's a lot of fake flowers. The store was started in 1972 in Oklahoma City, and originally it was just two guys selling handmade picture frames. And it took off after that because now there are 900 stores nationwide. So they're doing pretty well. Lots of Hobby Lobbies in the US. And the other thing that I thought worth commenting on is that they have really good hourly wages. They pay their employees $17 per hour, which the federal minimum wage in America is $7.25. Now, different states have different rules about this, and some cities do as well. But, compared to that, $17 is really good. So that's nice. The owner of Hobby Lobby is a man named David Green. And I'm going to talk about the Green family and his son, one of his sons, Steve Green, a lot. David Green comes from a line of Christian preachers, specifically fundamentalist evangelical preachers. All 5 of his siblings became either preachers in the faith or wives of preachers or pastors. And he has expressed a kind of regret that he went into such a secular field. So, despite this, he runs Hobby Lobby as a Christian organization. So on their website, you'll see they say, "We are committed to honoring the Lord in all we do by operating the company in a manner consistent with biblical principles." So yeah, it's absolutely a Christian store, and it influences the running of Hobby Lobby in a couple of ways. Like, for example, they're closed on Sundays, so no arts and crafts on Sundays. If you're not familiar with evangelical fundamentalist Christians, they believe that the Bible is word for word true and word for word the Word of God. So there's no allegories, there's no metaphor. It is exactly what happened. And so they run the business this way. Now, Green gives a lot of money to charity, as the Bible does tell you to do. And another commitment on their website is that they're committed to providing a return on the family's investment, so making lots of money, sharing the Lord's blessings with our employees, so that I would guess goes into the pretty good hourly wage, and investing in our community. And I believe what they mean by that is the fact that Green gives a lot of money to evangelical causes. So half of Hobby Lobby's pre-tax earnings are committed to a portfolio of evangelical ministries. So think like the most conservative Christian groups in America. However, unlike Chick-fil-A, for example, another Christian company in America that's been in the news, there's no record that I saw of Hobby Lobby or the Green family donating to specifically hate-mongering organizations like anti-LGBTQ organizations or anti-women organizations. So they, for the most part, flew under the radar of, well, at least for me, I wasn't aware of Hobby Lobby's sort of charitable or political actions until 2014. So in 2014, Hobby Lobby came up in the news a lot for taking a public stance against the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, or Obamacare. So I think everyone knows by now that in the US, healthcare is frequently provided through your place of employment, and so your employer determines the kind of healthcare packages available to you. And one provision of the ACA was to require workplaces to cover reproductive health care. And being evangelical Christians, the Green family was opposed to this. They do not want to offer comprehensive reproductive health care to their employees who have uteruses and healthcare needs. And so this was a big kerfuffle with the ACA. It wasn't just Hobby Lobby who had an issue with this provision, but Hobby Lobby sued the federal government and basically dismantled this provision. So there's no longer a requirement for employers to provide reproductive health care to their employees who might need it. But this is all legal. There's no crimes here. This is all just normal American stuff. The crimes don't come in until we get to another place where Hobby Lobby has decided to spend their money, and that is on the Museum of the Bible. So they, back in 2010, started this project. It didn't open until 2017, and it cost $500 million. Part of this was because of their location. They picked an old building in Washington, D.C. to house their museum. And this location is like very good. It's probably very expensive, but it's a very, very good location for a number of reasons. If you've never been to Washington, D.C., there are tons of museums and monuments and memorials, and they are all free to the public because they're federal museums and they are for us. And so if you go to DC, you wander around the National Mall, the Smithsonian is there, and the Smithsonian isn't just one museum, it's a whole complex. There are many different branches you can visit. And so this Museum of the Bible is pretty close to the Smithsonian, and I think one of the goals was to make it seem like it was a part of this federal museum complex, and it is not. And one way that you would know that it is not part of the National Museum complex, the Smithsonian, or any of the other museums or memorials around DC is that they do charge money for tickets. It's not free. For an adult, it costs $25 to enter. So I think they chose this place for two reasons. One is the reason I just mentioned, to make it seem like part of the American museum experience. The other part is because evangelical Christians and some other Christian groups in America really like to focus on American Christianity and how just this idea that America is a Christian nation, and somehow that there's a special relationship between Christianity and the United States. And this is a pretty ahistorical take because, of course, Christianity was not created on this continent. None of the people in the Bible ever came to America. But there is this interesting form of, I'm not even sure I can call it nationalism, but a focus on American Christianity. So I don't think it's surprising they would want to put their large, important to them museum in DC, and it is the world's largest Bible museum. Now, I've never been there, but I listened to an interview with Candida Moss, who is an author of the book Bible Nation, which is about Hobby Lobby and their sort of religious pursuits. She visited the museum, and this was in 2017, so it's probably changed since then. One would hope for a couple of reasons, but at the time, she found it fairly bizarre. She said they had a floor that was just Renaissance art, which really has nothing to do with the Bible at all. And her thought was that they had more space than they knew what to do with. I'm guessing, and she knew about the scandal and the crime at this point too, but you know, I wonder if they were struggling since their collection had legal issues. The museum is supposed to be about the history of the Bible. It focuses specifically on the history of the Bible in America, with very little discussion of the rest of the world, which again is a little bit odd given that the Bible was not written in America or the US, like at all. And then there are lots of old books, which Candida Moss said had very little explanation as to what they had to do with anything. Again, this was 2017, so one hopes that by 2021 they've made it more user-friendly. And then there were lots of animated films of the Bible story. So that is the Museum of the Bible. And one issue, and this is less a legal issue, is that it contains fakes. So they have fake artifacts. For example, they have fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, except that they are forgeries. And many scholars informed the Green family that they were forgeries, but they remained on display until 2020. So kind of like weird problems like that. And one of the reasons for these weird problems has to do with the way that they authenticate and evaluate their artifacts. They use a group called the Scholars Initiative, except that that is the new name. They used to be called the Green Institute, and they changed the name, I have to imagine, to give the Institute a veneer of objectivity. But these are people who work for the Greens. They are entirely evangelical scholars. Now, there's nothing wrong with evangelical scholars, but in any field where you want skepticism, where you want people to think critically, diversity of background really, really helps, because when everyone has the same background and the same beliefs, they're going to have the exact same blind spots. And that is a problem, again, because here, when you're trying to authenticate things like these Dead Sea Scroll fragments, you want skepticism, and you want people who have different methods and knowledge to apply that knowledge to know whether or not you're dealing with a fake. The other huge conflict of interest here is that every time this institute authenticates an artifact for the Green family, the Green family's personal net worth goes up. So this gives them an incentive. They work for the Green family, and so they are incentivized to say things are authentic or not, as opposed to not authentic. Like they work for them specifically. If this was a third-party group whose job was to be paid a fee to tell the truth, that would be one thing. That would be better. But this is not the case here. They are a group of people who work for the Green family, and thus there have been some mistakes. Now again, I don't think this rises to the level of crime. I think it is a bit embarrassing for the Green family, and sheds doubt on the quality of the museum and the sort of information you're going to get in it. But I don't think there are legal requirements for a museum, a privately owned museum, to be like true. So yeah, this is not crime at this point. But I will say, this is, other people reached out to them, people who agree with the Greens and their beliefs, scholars from the Vatican. A lot of scholars, both secular and religious, have raised issues with the narrative of this museum and the inclusion of fake artifacts. Okay, so let's get to the crime. The Greens wanted artifacts for their museum. They wanted artifacts that came from the time of when the biblical figures were alive. So, we're thinking thousands of years ago. And if you want artifacts regarding early Christianity or just early civilizations from thousands of years ago, the place to go is the Middle East. So starting in 2010, the Greens began purchasing artifacts for their collection from the Middle East. And this is where the crime came in, because they purchased smuggled artifacts that had been stolen from Iraq, and they smuggled them into the US. So they illegally shipped them with false labels into the US, and so this was sort of a twofold crime. The first being purchasing illegal artifacts, and the second was how they smuggled them into the US. Now the first part of that crime is easily blamed on ignorance. They were shown fake provenance papers and believed them. The second part, I think, is harder to excuse. If someone says, here are your, $1.6 million in artifacts, but we're going to label them something else and pretend they're something else, I think then that doesn't sound right. That sounds like crime. But they did it, and so they bought all of these clay tablets and seals that were from Syria, and they were labeled as tile samples. There were over 5,000 of these clay fragments, and in 2016, before the museum even opened, the feds were tipped off to this and went to examine the fragments, determined that they had been stolen illegally from Iraq, and demanded that the Green family return them. And that is what happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But first I want to talk about smuggling and the Middle East and Iraq and some other areas. Because Iraq contains the so-called cradle of civilization, like Syria, and has such a long history of people who were producing things like clay tablets and writing and mosaics and seals, things of the sort. It has a long history, and there are over 30,000 documented archaeological sites in Iraq. Now, not all of them have been excavated. They're just documented as places where there are probably lots and lots of artifacts. And that's just a lot. I read some personal accounts of people who live in the region, and they were saying, if you start digging, you'll find something. You'll find a tablet, you'll find a mosaic. This stuff is everywhere. But as of 1970, it is illegal to export antiquities without government permission. So basically, governments own items of historical importance. I'm not totally sure how this works out, like if you're digging in your own backyard and you find something, but these archaeological sites in Iraq are definitely protected and aren't just up for grabs for anyone to start digging and stealing. However, smuggling became a really big problem in Iraq, specifically in the 90s, when Saddam Hussein lost control of southern parts of the country following the war with Kuwait. And both museums in that area and ancient sites became vulnerable to looting. So there just wasn't police protection, military protection of these sites. And so people started stealing and carrying things over the border and selling them off. The smuggling problem got a lot worse after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The U.S. Army did not protect the National Museum in Baghdad in 2003, and it was pillaged. Looters just came in and took everything, and they also, they were thorough. They actually went in and found the records that the museum kept of their collections, and they set them on fire on the way out. And so museums, they take pictures of each item in their collection, they document it, they catalog it, and they do this for a number of reasons. But one reason is if something does get stolen, if something does get sold on the black market, they can show proof this came from our museum and you need to return it. And so the looters destroyed all of that documentation, which is just a real tragedy. I mean, the history of the country, was stolen during this time, and it's very upsetting. And one thing that came of this, because of all the illegalities, is there were strict rules regarding buying artifacts and knowing where they came from. So papers of provenance are pretty common for both art and artifacts, and for anything from Iraq, you want to see that the papers of provenance report to from before the 90s, and I think preferably back to the 50s or 60s. You want to see that these things weren't stolen, they weren't looted. Now, in the case of the greens, there were fake papers. And so, yeah, and according to the feds, they weren't very convincing fake papers. But the greens have claimed inexperience and naivete, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. We get to sort of the consequences of all of this. Now, back when this story was first reported, the smuggling, the artifacts in Hobby Lobby, this was back in 2017, there were a lot of headlines insinuating that Hobby Lobby might have funded ISIS or ISIL with their smuggled artifact purchases. And I'm going to say that there is no evidence of this, in part because the Greens purchased those original 5,000 artifacts in 2010, and ISIS didn't get involved in the smuggling business until a little bit after that. So it seems really unlikely there was any direct connection between Hobby Lobby and ISIS. But there is an indirect connection. So I'm going to talk about that for a minute. In the 2010s, ISIS was in the news a lot. They were taking over parts of Syria, and they were in Iraq. And the parts of Syria that they had control over didn't have much oil, and so ISIS needed money. And what they learned was that they could sell antiquities from Iraq and Syria over Facebook and make a lot of money. One man was saying, it's an archaeologist who lived in Syria, he was saying that a mosaic piece from near where he lived would probably sell for about $15 where he lived, but over the Facebook market they could sell it to someone in France for $35,000. So Facebook opened up this international trade in a way that was incredibly lucrative for anyone who wanted to smuggle. And ISIS wanted to smuggle, they wanted money. And so it's unknown how much money ISIS made from smuggling antiquities, but estimates range in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And again, this at the time was very sad. ISIS was smuggling and also just destroying parts of history. They were destroying, old art, old statues, and then selling off the rest. And these countries lost their history. So it was just a real tragedy. But back to Hobby Lobby, well, again, there's no evidence anything they purchased would have come from ISIS. Buying smuggled goods at all would have indirectly benefited ISIS, because basically if you're providing a market for smuggled goods and you're saying, I'm going to pay $1.6 million for these 5,000 artifacts, which is what they paid, more people are incentivized to smuggle, more artifacts will be looted to fill the demand that you are creating. And so, again, Hobby Lobby is not the only person, the only group that was buying up these artifacts, but they did infuse a lot of money into an illegal market that, again, was utilized by terrorist organizations in the Middle East. So that's not great, and it's a reason why you should stay away from smuggling. Okay, so what were the consequences of Hobby Lobby? What happened? Again, the smuggling was discovered before the museum even opened, so those 5,000 artifacts were never in the museum. Hobby Lobby was forced to pay a $3 million fine, and in May of 2018 there was a ceremony in Washington, D.C. to return the artifacts to the Iraqi government. However, there are more artifacts in the museum today that are suspected to have been looted from Iraq and other places. As of August 2020, the Iraq government was in talks with Hobby Lobby to determine if they were going to return the artifacts to Iraq or possibly pay a $15 million fine to Iraq, and then basically rent the artifacts to keep them in the museum for the time being. In May of 2020, Hobby Lobby had to return a cuneiform tablet that they had purchased from an auction house. The Hobby Lobby is now suing the auction house for faking the provenance documentation of that tablet. Just recently, another 5,000 artifacts were repatriated to Egypt after 5 years of Egypt lobbying for this and saying, hey, this entire exhibit was stolen from us and you need to return it. So yeah, they had an entire Egypt exhibit and the entire exhibit was repatriated. And then in addition, in 2018, Hobby Lobby admitted that some of their Dead Sea Scrolls were fakes, and in 2020 admitted that all of their Dead Sea Scroll fragments were fakes. So it wasn't just this one event in 2017. There have been a lot of problems with the artifacts in the Museum of the Bible owned by Hobby Lobby. I think I read there was another book that people were arguing over how it would return, if it would return, and after each incident, Hobby Lobby pledges to do better. But Steve Green, David Green's son, who runs the Museum of the Bible, he has attributed all of these issues to his own naivete, and nothing that he has done rises to the level of going to prison, for example. Buying stolen goods, I don't think generally will land someone in jail. I think if Hobby Lobby started selling the smuggled goods, then people would be in more trouble. However, in my opinion, there is only so long you can keep claiming naivete. Now, it's true, in 2010, Steve Green had no experience buying artifacts, so the first mistake, I think, yeah, it was a big mistake. It was a costly mistake. They spent $1.6 million on 5,000 artifacts. They had to pay a $3 million fine and give all the artifacts back, so that was a costly error. However, clearly this error has been repeated over and over again. I also think that when you are opening a $500 million museum, naivete isn't that good of an excuse. It's sort of taking responsibility without actually taking responsibility. It's saying, oh, it's my fault that these bad people took advantage of me. And when you have that much money at your disposal, you are able to pay experts to make sure you don't get duped. I don't think an expert would have cost $3 million to come with him on that trip. So there's a financial duty here to not get duped, but also I think the ethical and responsible thing to do would be to hire scholars who are good at their jobs, to use their expertise to make sure they're not, putting fake things on display, but also engaging in international smuggling trade. So I think the whole naivete excuse, it's been 11 years. It's an old excuse, and they've had time since 2016 to hire some experts to look at their collection and suss out the issues with it, to look at their provenance papers and say, oh, we have a problem here. They haven't done that, and I think part of it is pride. This museum is obviously about pride for them and their religion and their success, and I think part of it is also greed. No one, once they get a prize, wants to give that prize back. I have some other takeaways that were sort of unexpected in researching this crime. Well, this is a story about Hobby Lobby and their, if it's not shady business practices, I'm gonna go with maliciously ignorant business practices regarding their museum. It turns out that Facebook was the most instrumental tool in allowing some of the worst smuggling and pillaging of the Middle East to happen. Like I mentioned, ISIS used the Facebook marketplace to fund their terrorism, and Facebook did nothing about it. So those, $100 million, it was literally because Facebook gave them the international market that they did not have access to otherwise. And although ISIS is no longer the threat that it was, this is ongoing. According to archaeologists, up to 80% of artifacts sold on Facebook are smuggled and therefore illegal. But as far as I could tell, Facebook has done nothing to address this, and it's just ongoing. So more problems with Facebook, and despite the connection between Hobby Lobby and terrorism, I think Facebook has a lot more responsibility here. I also mentioned an auction house earlier where Hobby Lobby purchased a tablet. That auction house is actually Christie's in New York City, which is a very famous auction house. And this was really weird to me. Christie's was aware that their provenance papers were fake, and they responded by pledging to make a private sale rather than a public auction for the tablet in question, which was really weird to read because despite knowing that it was smuggled, they still intended to sell it and make money off of it. So I think it's really legitimate that Hobby Lobby is suing them over this. I think that it's super bizarre that they said, oh, we'll just make a private sale. Like, it's stolen, it's illegal, which means it has to be illegal to sell it again, right? I mean, once you know that their provenance papers are fake. But again, we're not on Wall Street this time, but there were still people who, they know that there's crime going on, but they know they can still make money off of the crime, so they don't care. And that has been a theme of these videos. And so this was sort of on the side, but that's Facebook, that's this auction house. There are still companies who think, money is way more important than ethics or the law. And I just found this dispiriting, but also kind of curious, because again, Christie's made this public statement about pledging to have a private sale of an illegal object. But this is not my area of expertise. I'm definitely not in the art or artifact world, so I don't know how normal this is, but I was reading about art forgeries recently, and I'm guessing it's pretty common. Like, yeah, if people can make a buck selling a forgery, even though they know it's a forgery, they're gonna do it, which is disappointing. So, yeah. Back to Hobby Lobby. Again, their crimes weren't, in the scheme of things, like as terrible as some of the other stuff we've talked about. And I'm less certain they were driven by greed versus religious zeal, pride, and ignorance. I do think at some point ignorance becomes malicious. And I do think that it is very irresponsible to have a museum that has smuggled goods and that, supports illegal smuggling rings, and that doesn't do a good job of vetting its artifacts either for legality or, authentication issues. So I would say this museum has problems. And it is worth noting again that the museum comes from the Hobby Lobby fortune. So it's your choice where to shop for your arts and crafts, what's convenient to you. But I do think it's worth knowing the kinds of causes that money goes to, especially in the case of the Green family, because they do give so much of their money away to political and religious causes. In addition to this Museum of the Bible, they are instrumental in the Republican Party, giving out endorsements. They are an important family there, and they are also, again, they don't do a lot of hate mongering, but they are involved in lobbying for basically teaching in the public school system and what they want taught or not taught in the public school system. And as evangelical fundamentalists, you can guess at what kind of things they might want to see there. So, yeah, that is where I'm going to leave you with Hobby Lobby and illegal antiquity smuggling. I would urge you, if you feel like buying some antiquities, to not do it on the Facebook Marketplace. It seems like eBay actually tries a little harder to make sure there's less smuggling there, but I bet it's still a big problem there too. I don't know. Okay, I hope you have a very good night. Good night. Thank you to my very generous supporters. It means a lot to me. Thank you to the Groucho, to Chris